And the topic I'm going to be talking about today is extremely important. I'd say it's vital, and it's something that most of us get wrong, and we have to get right. Because it's the foundation of everything. It's the foundation of our faith. I'm going to be talking about love. If you were to ask anyone, for the most part, including, by the way, concordant believers, to define love, most of them would define it first and foremost as a feeling. It's a strong attraction or an infatuation with somebody. You get butterflies in your stomach and you feel romantic. That's how people define love. That's what they think of. But the scriptures give us a very different definition of love, and we have to get this right. Marriages end as quickly as they begin in our country. Families are torn apart. Countless people kill themselves every year, all in the name of love. We read in 1 John 4 that God is love, so we start there. There are a lot of attributes we get in the Bible about God's character, different things that we can pull from and look and say, okay, this is an attribute God has. But there's one passage that tells us what God is, not what He's like. And that's 1 John 4. God is love. It's His very essence. It's His being. It's what makes Him up. So fortunately, we have a definition from the text for what that means to us. The whole law, according to Paul in Galatians 5:14, is summed up in the commandment to love others as ourselves and to love God. 613 mitzvot, or laws, these strict regulations in God's law, are summed up. All we have to do is remember this one foundational truth, that love covers everything. And we read at the end of 1 Corinthians 13, the famous love passage, that yet now are remaining faith, expectation, love, these three, yet the greatest of these is love. We talk a lot about faith, don't we? And about our expectation, our promised inheritance, what we have to look forward to. And we get really excited, and rightfully so, about those things. But Paul tells us, above those things, love is what's important. And we neglect this. We really do. We talk a lot about theological topics, about doctrines, and we don't really think about love that way, do we? We talk about it, but we don't understand that it's really the foundation for everything, and that it affects every area of our lives. In fact, it ties in with everything Clyde just taught on. And I guarantee it'll tie in perfectly with everything Martin talks on, too. Everything any of us could ever talk on, because it's the foundation. So let's turn to 1 Corinthians 13. And let's read what Paul has to say about love, how he defines this. Starting in verse 4, he says, love is patient, is kind. Love is not jealous, love is not bragging, is not puffed up, is not indecent, is not self-seeking, is not incensed, is not taking account of evil, is not rejoicing in injustice, yet is rejoicing together with the truth, is foregoing all, is believing all, is expecting all, is enduring all. And then in verse 8, love is never lapsing, or in most translations, love never fails. But I used to read through this passage and I thought, well, that's a little ambiguous. It's kind of odd. Love is this? And what I learned is it's a little easier to understand if we replace love here with someone who is loving. We can wrap our minds around that, I think, a little easier. So if we were to read it again, we'd have someone who is loving is patient, is kind. See, we can relate to that. If I'm a loving person, I'm going to be the things Paul says love is, and I'm going to not be the things that Paul says love is not. Right? So I've written up here, Paul kind of combines them. He starts off with love is, then lists off what it is, and goes back to what it is. But here are all of the things he tells us love is, and all the things that it is not. And I'm going to recommend something. that I've learned from my personal experience that's really helped me. And I'm going to get in with you to some personal things about my past and my marriage, or should I say my husband and wife covenant, that have taught me a lot. And what I've learned to do is to think of a love filter. And I'm going to take this down here and redraw. What's that? Okay. We'll put it, let's see. So how many of you have a filter system at home? Anybody? Mm-hmm. Okay, most people probably do. So we have a filter, and I think of this in my mind, and everything that passes through this filter, every decision that I make, I actually think about this. And I've just sort of trained myself over time to be able to do it. And that's really exactly what Paul's telling us to do here. He doesn't use the term filter, of course, but everything that goes in here has to be filtered through what love is and what love isn't. We have kind of two parts to this. Everything that meets approval here comes out the other end, and everything that comes in here falls out. So anytime you're confronted with a situation, all you have to do to figure out, am I acting in a loving way here or am I not, is to think about this. And I think it really helps to have simple, relatable tools to use, to think about. Because if I have to think all the time about, well, what exactly is love? How do I have to define it? Versus saying, I know what the scriptures teach about how I love other people. And I have this filter, everything comes in it, and only the good gets out. And over time, of course, we remember what love is and what it isn't, according to God's definition, and we can use this as a simple tool, and we can act that out. So, what we learn from 1 Corinthians 13, the most important thing I think we learn, is that all of these things we have in the filter, what love is and what it isn't, are actionable items. These are things that we do or not do. Not things, let me repeat that, not things that we feel. Now, again, all of us equate love with feeling. And I don't want you to get the impression through my talk today that I'm saying feelings have no part of love. They definitely do. In fact, another similar analogy to this that I use for myself is, kind of like a gas tank. It's like we all have a reservoir, this tank, and we need something to fuel it. And feelings oftentimes are the fuel that motivate us to act in love. But the key question, should we act in love toward others if we don't feel like it? And this is, when you could probably attest to this, being in counseling and things. I don't know how many married couples you do, but I would be willing to bet, I bet $1,000 right here and now, that one of the main problems with torn apart marriages is that people don't act in love if they don't feel love. Yeah. So let's turn to Romans 5:8 and see what Paul has to say about acting in love and our feelings. He says, God is commending this love of his to us, seeing that while we are still sinners, Christ died for our sakes. Really think about that. Let it sink in. God and Christ showed their love to us. They didn't just feel love toward us. They showed us love by doing something when we were completely undeserving of it. If we're going to imitate Christ, and if we're going to follow him as our head, then we have to do the same thing. So what does this mean, practically speaking, in your life? Now, some of you in here are married and some aren't, but all of you have relationships. All of you have co-workers, friends, All of us meet strangers every day. If we don't feel love toward these people, if we feel that they're undeserving of that love, what are we supposed to do? Well, this is our answer. It doesn't matter if the recipient is undeserving. In fact, the more undeserving, listen to this, the more undeserving the person is of receiving our love, the more remarkable it is when we grant it, and the more Christ-like we are when we give it. Jesus told his Jewish brothers to not claim credit for only loving those who love them in return. Matthew 5:46 and Luke 6:32. Does he mean here that they should feel love toward them? Well, of course he doesn't. Why? Because we can't control very easily how we feel, can we? No. But we can control how we act. It's hard when we don't feel like acting a certain way. But if I told you, Ed, go out to this random stranger and you have to feel love for him, that's going to be pretty hard. Yeah. I mean, the more Christ-like you are, maybe the easier that will be. But Martin, if I ask you to feel love for Joel Osteen, you going to be able to do it?
No.
What about President Obama?
No.
Is it going to be easy? No. But can you control how you act toward them? Yeah. So we have to change our way of thinking about this, and it's hard. So I told you I'd give you a little background on my marriage and let you know why I've sort of come around to thinking this way. My wife and I have been through a lot. In fact, early on in the marriage, and this happens often in probably most marriages, adjusting, getting used to changes and things, it was really, really hard. And it was to the point where, we almost split up. My wife almost left. And I was lying in bed one night, and I had talked with friends and even people in our group saying, you need to leave. You need to be done with this. And I could never trust this person and so forth. And I laid there and I thought, and this was God, putting this in my mind, giving me these thoughts. But I realized, I've expected all along my wife to act a certain way toward me. I've expected her to earn my love. And when she's been undeserving of it, I haven't granted it because I haven't felt like granting it. It's very difficult to give love to somebody, to show them love when you don't feel love from them or you feel like they're undeserving. But I thought, Jesus says, I can't claim any credit if I only love my wife or anyone else when they love me in return. So I committed, and of course, I haven't always done a great job with this, but I committed then to loving my wife through action, regardless of how I felt, and to trying to do it more so when I felt she was more undeserving of it. So my wife would yell at me for I felt no reason and be cruel. I would buy her flowers. And you can transfer this into any area of your life with any relationship you have. A coworker wrongs you and is, maybe they're jealous of you, or they try and steal a promotion or talk bad to your boss about you to get one up. Take the coworker out to lunch and tell them how much you appreciate them being on the team. Your child wrongs you. Now, we all have a natural love for our children, so it's easier, especially when they're young, to forgive them and to show them love in spite of how you feel. But the same should be true of every relationship that we have. So, feelings are important, especially with husband and wife relationships, any intimate relationships, because they're like the fuel that fills our tank and motivates us to act. I mean, husbands and wives better be attracted to each other, right? They better have feelings for each other. It's awfully nice. But when people marry and they think that their marriage is based on feeling, what happens the second that they get in a big argument, which is inevitable, by the way? It's not an if, it's a when issue. So when that happens, what do you do? If you define love as a feeling, and you're not going to grant love if you don't have the feeling, the marriage is going to end as quickly as it begins. And that's what happens all the time. And what's ironic is that I used to think as a husband, I need to lead my wife, and that means always being truthful and telling her how it is. So I wasn't very, very respectful of her feelings. And of course, love is rooted in truth, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So when we love someone, oftentimes we have to tell them the truth in love. And it's this sort of constructive criticism. It can be a rebuke, and it can be harsh, and oftentimes it's what they need to hear. That's the loving act. But we tiptoe around this, and we think, well, the loving thing to do is to be dishonest, or to beat around the bush, not confront the person, not hurt their feelings. And we have to be considerate of that, but ultimately our love, the way we love others, has to be rooted in truth. So I used to understand this, but I thought, I just need to tell my wife how it is, and she's just going to have to accept it. How do you think that works? Yeah, not very well. And then I started to realize, I can act in love toward her no matter how she's treating me. And once I did that, what I was surprised by was that the results were so much better. And she told me pretty recently, she said, we had all those really hard years. And she said, the one thing that brought me closer to you and closer to God, stronger in my faith, was not you teaching me the scriptures as much as witnessing you loving me when I was wrong to you. So that's the key. That's what has to happen. When you think this is on track with what you teach people in counseling?
It's like I tell them, when you look at them, you can see one of two things. You can either see the good or you can see the bad, and you make the choice. If you're out constantly looking for the bad in a person, you're going to find it. Love motivates us to look for the good.
Yeah. Well, and along those lines, even if all you see is bad, you can still love. That's exactly what Christ did, isn't it? Mm-hmm. He had no reason at all to feel anything for us. They're perfect. And compare that to the stark contrast of all of us who are wretched, miserable sinners and completely undeserving of their love. And Christ, under God, commits the greatest sacrifice for our sakes that has ever been known or will ever be known. And any time that you find yourself in a situation where it's really hard to love someone, and you say, I know this. I know I need, I'm running stuff through the filter, but my tank's really low. I feel like I'm on E, and I don't really have a lot of motivation to love. Just think about Christ and how he's been acquainted with every one of our griefs, all of our suffering. There is nothing that the Father spared him from from birth to Calvary. He's experienced it all, and far more than any of us ever will. So we can rest in that. And we need to understand that whether it's in a marriage, or it's in a relationship with a coworker or a stranger, anybody that we have conflict with and we don't feel like loving, they're undeserving in our eyes, but we know we need to grant them love, we need to remember what Christ did. So, I talked a minute ago about the fact that love is rooted in truth. And oftentimes, that means telling the truth in love. Being constructive. But what does that look like? If I go to Martin and we're debating maybe an issue, and we both feel it's really important for people to understand this stuff, and we're going to, one of us may be considering teaching on it, And he studied this maybe more, and he's confident that I'm wrong, and I could be doing damage by teaching it. Mark, I mean, what's the loving thing to do there?
Just agree with whatever I say.
I'm saying on your end, what's the loving way to handle it? Would it be to say, Steve, go ahead and teach that, because you don't want to step on my
No,
toes.
of course not.
No. And we look at how Christ acted in many instances, and it was always with the religious leaders of the day. Now, did Christ love them any less? Did he feel less for them? Maybe, right? Maybe. But see, and the way that he loved them was by being brutally honest, by throwing money tables over in the temple, by calling them publicly a brood of vipers and whited sepulchres, all whitewashed on the outside and full of dead men's bones and corruption within. Those were loving words, right? Understand that. We look at that and say, well, that's pretty hateful. It's really surprising that the perfect, loving Son of God, who is love, would say those things.
Faithful in the wounds of a friend.
That's right. So there's a fine line here, isn't there? But guess what Jesus was doing when he confronted the Pharisees? He was doing this. He was asking, well, he already knew, right? But if we were there and we were called to do the same thing, he's running it through this. He's saying, is the way I'm treating them right now kind? Well, really, in that context, it was, because it's exactly what they needed to hear. Was it patient? Well, it was pretty abrupt, but I'd say that overall, over the grand scheme of things, Jesus was pretty darn patient. Of course, he knew the plan anyway, so we don't know exactly what the Father's plan is, and that requires us to be patient. But all the things that Paul tells us in Corinthians are the love is or the love is not. Jesus perfectly put those into practice all the time. Yeah.
This is kind of a corollary in medicine. I've had patients who are diabetic and were really not wanting to go on the needle on insulin, and their doctors just let them have their way. They weren't acting in the patient's best interest.
Yeah.
They weren't being loving and kind, which was a lot tougher route to go, and then the patient suffered for it. Yeah. Like enabling too, yes. But,
Yeah, that's a great example.
yeah,
You're saving the person
yeah,
if you do what they don't want you to do.
yeah.
That's good. Love is not giving everyone what they want. Love is giving people what they need. Now, in marriage relationships, this is, or husband and wife relationship, I'm being very careful with my semantics now after Clyde's talk. But in that relationship, it's much more important that, because we live with each other, we're with each other all the time, we're having sex together, so there's this really intimate connection. And us husbands, we want to be very careful to make sure that our wives are cared for and their needs are met to the best of our abilities. So it can be very scary sometimes to be firm and say, well, honey, this is an issue that you have that we need to address. But as long as it's done with patience and it's done with kindness and it's not done for all the reasons that Paul lists out, love is not, then it's going to be a success. So we can't be afraid to be confrontational in love when it's necessary. Our goal cannot be to always make sure that our wives or our friends or whoever's feelings are perfectly intact. Because what's going to happen a lot of the time, if needed, is if we tell them the truth in love and then they have a harsh reaction to it at first, they're eventually going to come around. And they're going to see that we were really acting out of love. But as long as our motives aren't selfish, we should be okay. So I'm going to pull this up again, and we're just going to go over some more details. I'm just pulling it up here. I thought it was one of the sticky kind that I could just hang on the wall. Okay, so here's what goes in the filter. Love is patient, it's kind, it rejoices with truth. So again, I was saying earlier, love is rooted in truth. And oftentimes that means worrying more about what's in someone's best interest than just their feelings. It's foregoing all, believing all, expecting or hoping for all, and enduring all. And I underline all here because we all feel like we have a breaking point. And sometimes I tell my wife this, and I shouldn't. Sometimes I'll say, honey, I think everyone has a point where they just need a break and they just can't handle anymore. And then I think, oh, wait a minute, I'm supposed to imitate Christ, and he didn't have a breaking point. Paul says to imitate him. He didn't really have a breaking point in loving others. So it endures all. We put up with everything. If your spouse or friend or whoever is completely undeserving, up the game. Be more loving, because your love is going to be more remarkable. It's more honorable to God to do that. Love is not bragging. It's not puffed up or arrogant. It's not indecent, self-seeking. So love is selfless, just as Christ was for our sake. It's not incensed or angry. It doesn't take account of evil. This is really important. I remember a while back, Clyde talked about the slate that the church gives us, and we have this morbid slate every morning. Like we start off writing down all the sins we've committed throughout the day, and then at nighttime, we pray and we ask God to forgive all of them, and throw in a little disclaimer, if there's anything I forgot. But we don't take evil into account and hold it against others because God doesn't do it here. It's interesting, isn't it, that we know God is love and that he doesn't take evil into account. But that's exactly what Christianity teaches he does. And it doesn't rejoice in injustice. So after this talk, I don't know what each of you felt before today about love, but I can tell you what the Bible says about it. Remember that love, or someone who is loving, an easier way to understand it, is someone who is all the things Paul lays out in 1 Corinthians 13 and is not the things that he doesn't. Remember that God is love, and that God is defined by all of these characteristics. That the more undeserving someone is in our eyes of our love, and the less we feel of giving them our love, the more we should up the game to give it to them, because that's exactly what Christ does, and we honor God and we imitate him by doing that. That is the key to having successful relationships in life, whether it's in a marriage, at work, with a friend, with a stranger, with anybody. And that's the way to truly be happy, because love is the foundation of everything. It's what God is. It's his essence. It's the main thing that everything we do is rooted in and that we have to get right. Pretty short talk on my end for this.
Short, but